nickname.
C Money.
Could you hear that? Okay, was that enough? Good. All right, welcome into another episode of DNVR Avalanche's At the Rink podcast. I'm Meghan Angley. This is Jesse Montano. We're back for another one, and it's kind of a pour one out to the NHL 2023 regular season.
Yeah.
I'm glad we'll get this episode not out of the way, but discuss these topics now, because moving forward, it's going to be dominated by playoff conversations. And as teams get eliminated, our focus is going to become so much more limited to those teams that are remaining. So we'll have plenty of time to dive into that as the playoffs carry on. But for today, we can keep it kind of league-wide focus to start.
Yeah.
Before we do the league-wide focus, though, I did want to talk about Gabriel Landeskog. We've done a lot of content, but we haven't done anything here in the At the Rink umbrella for it yet. I know you have the full media availability linked in this week's Sunday at the Rink piece, which is free and unlocked for everybody to read this time around.
I was going to say that I wanted to make sure we mentioned that Meghan, you were the one that suggested having this week's piece be free and unlocked. And it's for a lot of the reasons you just mentioned. This is the time in between, for me at least, the end of the regular season and the start of playoffs are always really fun, because you do get to kind of close a chapter on a lot of what we've seen, and there's so much to discuss. And starting tonight at 5 p.m., which I'm so excited for, playoffs do officially get underway, and that's really kind of where the hockey world's focus goes. But there's so much stuff out here to talk about, especially with a guy like Gabe Landeskog. And like you said, we're probably not going to drop in any of Landy's availability into the show, because I think this will already be a little bit of a long show with some of the other stuff we got going. But it was about 20 minutes and some change. And it is linked in the At the Rink piece. And as Meghan said, we decided to make this one free and unlocked this week, because I just thought that there was, like I said, you suggested it, but I agreed. There was just so much good content in there that we wanted to make sure that everybody had a chance to read it.
Definitely. And before we move on from the Landeskog conversation, I wanted to invite everyone to listen to that media availability if they haven't had a chance to, because at this point, everything to know is known that he won't return for the 2023 playoffs.
Yep.
And his return timeline is still a bit unknown given the nature of his injury, cartilage injury. You wrote a little bit about it, but I guess I just wanted to give some finality to it so we can move forward into the playoff conversations after this.
Yeah, and so the other important part to note about all of this, and I think I like your idea. Maybe I'll put a little bit of this out separately. We did get to hear from Chris McFarland yesterday before practice got going. And as you can imagine, again, very generous for this time, also read about 20 minutes. Early on, there was a lot of conversation about Gabe Landeskog. How much did the team actually know? How much did it impact decisions at the trade deadline? Things like that, because that's what everyone's wondering. And while I think some of the criticisms have been way over the top, I think it's fair to question what all did you actually know? How much did this impact your trade deadline? Because as much as you and I have kind of laughed over the last few days, just again, some of the reactions out there have been like, take it down a level, like conspiracy theories and all this stuff. But it's a fair question. $7 million that the Avs didn't really end up tapping into. I think when the season ended, they didn't have the cap space to activate Landeskog, but not by all that much. They didn't really utilize that $7 million. So it's fair to wonder, but essentially, Meghan, what I've gathered from talking to Chris McFarland, hearing from Gabe Landeskog, and then just talking to other people around the organization, or just around, I really don't think they anticipated this. And you can tell me if maybe you've read between the lines differently, but I really do, like I said, from everything I've gathered, I think coming into the season, they weren't expecting any issues. Then we hit training camp, and right before training camp, they realized, yes, there's some problems here. Maybe another procedure, surgery. I don't really know what the difference is. They are classifying them differently. miss a little bit of time, and then it's just kind of snowballed from there. And then I thought it was interesting that Gabe Landeskog used the word plateau when talking about his recovery. I asked him, were there any setbacks? He said nope. And really what I've kind of gleaned from all this is they were tracking progress a certain way, and then at a certain point, it just stopped. Just wasn't getting any better, wasn't getting any stronger, and they're kind of going back to the drawing board. Chris McFarland said that really what they decided to do with the deadline had basically nothing to do with Gabe Landeskog, whether he was in or out, that they were making decisions based on what they thought were best for the organization, both short and long term. And look, Meghan, this is the part that I argued in Sundays at the Rink this week was I kind of agree with them saying we're just going to roll with what we've got. We went over this a little bit on shows at the end of the week, but when you run through the list of guys who were available come trade deadline, gosh, Meghan, I don't know. Was there really anyone that moved the needle for you? For me, it was Ryan O'Reilly, and he was gone weeks before.
The way I break it down is of what assets would have been needed to give up for Ryan O'Reilly, it just wouldn't have been possible, especially knowing what we do now about Landeskog. And Chris McFarland says it had no impact, but I have to imagine it had some impact in not knowing because you mentioned this too, but taking a big swing and moving assets and then not having a Landeskog available changes a lot of things because even if you get a return, you gave up something. I don't know if it would have been an active roster player, but we look at the college free agency grab that they did for the Eagles, and there's a reason for that. Their prospect pool's quite depleted.
And McFarland acknowledged that.
They don't want to be like a lot of people have acknowledged that. They're being very frank about the reality of the situation with the prospect pool currently, and even just with throwing around picks. Even though the Lars Eller, sure, there's a pick involved, they don't want to be throwing around quite too many. So for a Ryan O'Reilly acquisition, I think it would have asked for too much. Similarly, there are players who didn't quite move the needle, like a Max Domi, and seeing in Dallas that the production just hasn't been so different from Lars Eller. I know it's easy, rear view 2020, it's easy to say that, but I think we came to know that Max Domi also just might not have been a great fit. There's a reason he was available the day the deadline closed. Only one who stands out is, sure would have been nice is Nino Niederreiter, but even still, that's one person. There's no team that can get it right every single deadline. Avs got it really right last deadline, like last deadline. That I'm with you. I don't think there was a player that moved the needle quite too much for me. And, Landeskog, news or not, there would have been too much given up, I think.
I agree with you. And look, I will say, I think had the Avs landed Ryan O'Reilly, I think that would have made it almost like a wash. You know what I mean? Like, cool, you brought in O'Reilly, you lost Landeskog, you feel pretty comfortable going back into the playoffs that, hey, we can do this again. And for them to feel comfortable giving up, to your point, big assets to make that move, I think they would have had to know definitively a month before the deadline when Ryan O'Reilly got moved that Gabe Landeskog, not only was he not coming back for the regular season, but he wouldn't be back at any point in the postseason. That's the only way where I think they could have said, we felt it made sense to, by the way, they would have had to up their offer. They weren't in on Ryan O'Reilly. They got outbid by Toronto, who paid a decent price. They would have had to up their bid to convince the St. Louis Blues to trade him in the division to a team that there is a bit of a rivalry there with. So the price would have been a little bit higher. He's the only guy that I thought, when I looked back at the pool of players that were available, I would have said, that's the one guy that I would have felt like I said, kind of was a 1-for-1. Everyone else, I'm with you. Had you given it up and then we got this news, I feel like I would have more had the thought of you would have rather held on to those assets. Because now you head into the summer, and look, I'm sure you got the same answer up in Loveland. When we talked to Chris McFarland yesterday, he said, we're getting through the playoffs first. And obviously there's going to be stuff with Landeskog going on behind the scenes. But he basically said, we're going to get through the playoffs and then we'll see where we're at. And the way I'm taking that is we're going to go into the summer. Gabe Landeskog acknowledged, and I think we can pretty safely count on this is going to bleed into next year, probably a decent portion of next year. I'll be honest, Meghan, if not the entire season next year. I think that's maybe where they're at. We need to like hard stop on all of this and get him right. They're now going to be able to go into the summer, and if you know that you're going to end up with a potential Nikita Kucherov situation where he's on a better understanding rehab path, we now kind of know what's going on a little bit better. Feels like the last 9 months have been like a one big discovery phase for Landeskog. You can hit the summer and say, cool, now we have that cap space to play with. You can go into the draft and say, we still have all these draft assets that we didn't spend at the deadline. And now we can try to bring in a player that we're not just going to get 6 weeks out of. We're going to bank on having a player for an entire year. We can kind of build our roster planning to not have Gabe Landeskog. I wholeheartedly believe the plan this entire season was to have Gabe Landeskog. And I think on deadline day, they were expecting we will get some regular season games out of Gabe. And I think that's why we found out why they chose not to pursue a defenseman and dip into Eric Johnson's cap space, because he's going to
get healthy.
They knew he was going to get healthy. We all didn't know that. I think that was always the plan with Gabe until it wasn't. And so I think now they're just going to go into this summer, into the draft, with a much better understanding of where he's at, where they're at, where the money situation is at. And now you've held on to all of these assets. I don't think this is an issue, especially we're going to get into the playoff conversation. Meghan, I still think this is the team to beat out West, even with no Gabe. Obviously, I'm not guaranteeing they're going to get through the Stanley Cup final. I think the West is better than people are giving it credit for. There's good teams. I still think they're the team to beat, even without Gabe. You might as well just play with the house money you've got. You are still currently the defending Stanley Cup champions. Play with the house money. If it doesn't happen this year, I don't want to say, oh, well, but you are still in the heart of your window, in the front end of your championship window. You got time here. I think overall, I'm happy with the way that they managed assets and handled the deadline. Now knowing Gabe's uncertainty, and I know people aren't going to like that because they want teams to gear up every single time. I just feel like it would have been hard for them to go all in without having all of their own pieces to begin with.
I definitely agree, because you talk about the window, and it wouldn't have been worth it for this team to remain competitive for years to come to blow up the team at this deadline. And
100%.
The other part of it is the human component. I think people are rightfully having a reaction to the loss of the captain. Like, the fan base is rightfully mourning that. And I think that's where there is a mixed bag of emotions, of frustration and disappointment and concern. And the part I go back to is the way in which this was handled was with Landeskog in mind, with his input, his influence. I think that the uncertainty is because they are looking to him to give that green light, right? And when they are listening to him, when he says, I'm targeting the postseason, or I'm targeting March, they're listening to him, they're trusting him. And it has to go both ways. Like, they could have not listened to Landeskog and pulled the plug on this sooner, and we probably would have also been frustrated by that, that they didn't have the courtesy of listening to him.
Right.
And his own body. And so...
And it would have been, why are you punting so early?
Right.
Why aren't you waiting as late as possible?
And so I know that it's disappointing for it to come about this time of year, but it is a courtesy to Landeskog.
Yeah.
And if you care about Landeskog, the person, you want to be glad that he gave it his all. He, and it's disappointment that it ends in this conclusion, but that is your captain making those decisions, and the fan base looks to him with trust for all other decisions when it comes to the team.
Yeah,
exactly. And if you have that trust for him to lead this team as a captain, you have to have a little bit of trust too when it comes to listening to his body. And it stinks that it ended this way, but this is going to be, like you said, getting him right. This is going to be the best possible scenario for getting him right in the future and returning back to this Avalanche group one day.
And then I'll kind of wrap up my thoughts on this, just building off what you said there. I think where a lot of the frustration comes, and this part, I get it. I get it. The Avalanche, and Gabe even acknowledged this, historically, they are very tight-lipped on this stuff. And they don't give us a lot of information. They are one of the teams that sticks the most strict to the NHL's They basically draw a line at the hips and say upper body, lower body, and that's all you have to give. And the Avs lean into that maybe more than any other organization in the NHL. They keep all of that stuff as tight-lipped in-house as possible. You've had national reporters, major insiders like Elliot Friedman, Chris Johnston, publicly admit the Colorado Avalanche are one of the hardest organizations in pro sports to get information out of. It's the old Pierre Lacroix way, and it's just stuck. So I think people maybe feel like a lot of this was deceptive, that the Avs knew all along that this is where we were heading. I genuinely believe, because Meghan, you and I talk about that frustration, I promise, more than any of the fans out there. Like we deal with that every day, and it's frustrating and it's hard because, we make the joke sometimes where it's like, we're just trying to do our job. Like, we're here asking questions not to like get anybody. We're trying to do our job. And it's really frustrating when we can't get that information. This is one situation where I genuinely feel like they were being forthcoming with the information they had. We're just finding out they didn't have a lot of information, and they were purely going day to day, week to week with how he was feeling, how it was recovering. And they had to pull the plug on this when all of that just stopped progressing. And, Gabe said that we had to make this decision because we found out that being on the ice wasn't productive. It was leading to a lot of speculation, leading to a lot of public scrutiny. I thought it was interesting how he said rehabbing in the public eye can be difficult, and I get that. And he didn't want his teammates answering questions on it while they're trying to chase down another Stanley Cup. So I really do believe that this was one of the few situations where the Avs weren't trying to pull the wool over on anyone. When Jared Bednar was saying, I don't know about Gabe Landeskog, I now firmly believe he didn't know. And so I think that's where a lot of the frustration came from. Oh, they knew. They were just, classic Avs. They were just staying quiet. I don't think that's the case with this one in particular.
I'm glad you validated the frustration too. It is rightful, and you're right. The timelines we were given, the March 15th that the Elliot Friedmans were given, is what everyone was being given. And they happened to be wrong because they were wrong. Like, even Landeskog himself had to face the music. All right, March 15th is not going to happen. But he thought it would at one point. And that's just difficult. I want to validate that frustration.
And I think that's a great point, Meghan. The fact that there was even dates out there, and the fact that ESPN even had a couple of reports out there, to me says this was handled differently than other Avalanche injuries, right? We're expecting Cale Makar, Josh Manson to be back, but even that, they're kind of tiptoeing, well, yeah, we're hoping, we're like, that's the kind of stuff where they do get a little cute with it. This Gabe Landeskog stuff, like you said, the fact that there were dates out there being reported by the Elliot Friedmans, the Emily Kaplans of the world, tells you this was handled a little bit differently.
Definitely. Now we can move into the broader conversation about the year at hand and just some of the changing landscape too, moving into this Stanley Cup playoffs. I was going to head it off with the coaching changes and the front office changes that have happened around the league. I mean, so we start with Bruce Boudreau kind of in the season, but then Dallas Eakins, Brad Larson, Peter Laviolette, and then just like the entirety of the
Penguins,
the Pens front office. Thank you. Those are some pretty big changes to come, and some of that leads into the conversation of the Ovechkin Crosby piece in not having these players available to watch for the Stanley Cup playoffs, and also knowing that there are going to be some of the league's top talent still available to watch in the Stanley Cup playoffs. It's an interesting turning of the page, but I think starting with a lot of those management changes, you can expect too for players to also be on the move going into next season. It just creates, like, next year, I think the NHL is going to look very different.
I don't think the NHL is ever going to get to the point of, like, the NBA where they fully embrace the chaos and superstar players are on the move. I do still think that, whether people like it or not, the hockey culture thing is still, you see guys like Nathan MacKinnon. Nathan MacKinnon really wanted to. He could have walked up to free agency this year and made $15 million. But no, like, those types of players, and it's not just Nathan MacKinnon, I'm just using him as the example. Like, there is a different sense of loyalty, I think, in the NHL. Rightly or wrongly, however you feel about it, I do just think that players, on the whole, like to be loyal to teams that drafted them, teams that took a chance on them. I think Val Nichushkin is a good example of this. Dude could have easily gone into free agency and cashed a huge check, And I mean, he did all right here in Colorado. But, that's a team that he understood his fit. He understood the value in this relationship. But I think you're right, Megan. I think this summer is going to be so interesting because I do think we are heading in that direction a little bit where there's just going to be changes and there's going to be obviously a lot of coaching changes, general manager changes. And the one that I think is most interesting is what's happening in Pittsburgh. I'm not quite ready to shut the book on the Sidney Crosby, Evgeny Malkin, Chris Letang, Pittsburgh Penguins, because I think they've had a lot of goaltending problems in the last couple of years. And the fact that they just barely miss, I don't know, they get some goaltending help this summer. I think it's very plausible they could be right back in the playoffs next year. But I do think this is the first sign that Sidney Crosby, Alex Ovechkin, they can't single-handedly drag their teams in anymore. They need help. And what I find so interesting about Pittsburgh is the front office clean out. I know Sid and all of them came out this weekend and said, no, we want to keep him a Penguin for life. Well, the Blackhawks also said they wanted Jonathan Taves and Patrick Kane to retire as Blackhawks. Things change. New management comes in and we're going to talk about Chicago, and we spoke with Jayzawaski from CHGO later, and he basically said, like, look, Kyle Davidson came in and said, this is great. I'm here to do a job. I don't have time to be loyal to history or all that stuff. We are trying to win. We are trying to get back into being competitive. I think if you head into next year, you get a new GM, you get an entirely new front office in Pittsburgh. If they miss the playoffs by more than they did this year or things just don't get back on the rails, I don't necessarily think they're going to be looking to flip Sid at the deadline, but I think you are going to start to be staring down those conversations as the end of his contract draws nearer and nearer of, okay, how good does it do us to have Sidney, if we are going to start the rebuild process, how much value is it to us to have Sidney Crosby just hanging around missing the playoffs? And how interested is Sidney Crosby in hanging around missing the playoffs to end his career? It's just going to be interesting because I think you are now heading into territory of having those conversations. I think Alex Ovechkin will be in Washington until he breaks Wayne Gretzky's goal record. I'm not even willing to entertain anything different. But I think you are getting into this territory of how much, like I said, how much do we want these guys just sitting around if we're trying to rebuild? How interested are they in staying around if we're trying to rebuild? There's questions around Evgeny Kuznetsov in Washington. Is he going to stick around? That relationship has soured a bit. How does that affect Alex Ovechkin? That is kind of the last Russian, teammate he's got there. There's massive questions around Nicholas Backstrom and his health. It's just that we are now getting into the era of these are going to start to be legitimate conversations in the years to come. And it's just jarring because, those have been the faces of the NHL for almost 2 decades now.
It is hard to process. I think the call out with Ovechkin remaining in Washington is fair. I think a lot of why Washington has the year they have is because of injury. And I want to give them credit because Avalanche fans know that better than anyone, what it's like to have injury just eviscerate your roster like that. And I think Washington has struggled with that a lot at points this year. That for an Ovechkin, I'm sure he also realizes that context and imagines next year to be different. But with Crosby in Pittsburgh, it does feel different. It does feel like the Pittsburgh Penguins of today also look really different from the sort of dynasty era of Pens hockey that he came to know and love. And he's a captain. I don't think you abandon ship outright. But I look at just the flexibility too in Pittsburgh and what they're even going to be able to do to make changes. And they were so limited at the deadline. Their hands were tied with cap as well, similar to the Avalanche, that I don't know. It's really interesting to think about. I think it's a possibility for Crosby, but I would also not be surprised if he remained a Pen. And I think the Chicago part in the conversation is interesting because Chicago's obviously in a different position from Pittsburgh in that they have been barreling to the bottom for a little bit now. And they made big changes in this offseason going into this year that you didn't think they were going to move on from a Kirby Dach at one point in time, but they do. And Then Kane leaves and Taves is leaving at the end of this year. Do you think, well, and I guess we could throw that to our CHGO expert when we get there, but I guess, is there anything you wanted to add to the league-wide conversation, sort of the changing of the guard, turning the page? Is it looking ahead at what the playoffs have to offer in Connor McDavid and Austin Matthews and Nathan McKinnon being players that we are going to be able to watch?
Yeah, so I mean, that is a huge part of it for me, is that this season right here, I mentioned it even, I think it was right around trade deadline. As unbelievable as Connor McDavid is, in my eyes, Megan, in my opinion, right now today, Sidney Crosby is the greatest player that's ever played. I think he's the most, you don't have to agree, people don't have to agree with it. I think he's the most well-rounded player that has ever played the game. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that training and technology and understanding and all of that stuff, coaching, everything has gotten better throughout the years. No one will ever be as dominant against their peers as Wayne Gretzky was. So everyone calm down. But like just pure talent, Sidney Crosby, like I marvel at him still to this day, right? But this really is kind of the first sign of like their time is starting to come to a close. We're entering the final chapter, right? And the league is turning over to those players that you just mentioned, you know, Makar, McDavid, Matthews, McKinnon. You could even throw in guys like Jason Robertson, in there
Easily.
And there's 10 guys that I didn't mention there, but you know what I'm saying. It's just interesting, and I'm just going to be really fascinated to watch, because here's the one other part of all of this, Megan. I made the joke a couple times. I ran that draft simulator for the first time in a couple of years this last week. I ran it 7 times. The Washington Capitals won it twice. I'm not saying that's likely here on May, whatever it is, 6th or 9th or whatever. But that just shows if a team like Washington, Pittsburgh jumps up into that top 3, it changes this conversation completely.
That's a good point.
It changes this completely. Now you're not talking about them, entering this rebuild phase. It's kind of a rejuvenized shot in the arm, and now you are riding off into the sunset with, Sidney Crosby, Alex Ovechkin kind of handing the franchise over to the next wave, let alone if they were to get the top pick in Connor Bedard, things like that. So there's a lot that can happen, but it's a little sad for me because, you've always heard from like the generation ahead of us, like, getting to watch these guys and having them retire and blah, blah, blah. It's just sad that we're entering into that phase with in high school and all that stuff. I watched Sidney Crosby and Alex Ovechkin religiously. And so it's going to be interesting because I think we are entering into a new phase of the NHL. I think the next wave of young players is really exciting, electric, skilled. I know people are 50-50 on Trevor Zegras, as a personality, but who can argue with that kind of talent level? And I think you're going to see a lot more of that coming into the league and really starting to take over. And so that part's exciting. But it's going to be weird to start seeing Alex Ovechkin, Sidney Crosby, on the second page of things, if you will.
Calgary moving on from their GM.
Oh, they are.
It's happening right now. And so that's another coaching change I'm anticipating.
Megan, so I don't think so.
Really?
Just some of the chatter. And now look, maybe a new GM comes in and says, we're not doing this anymore with Sutter. Some of the folks I've spoken to think that they're kind of committed to him there for at least one more year. It's going to be fascinating because this season did not go at all how Calgary planned it.
No, I personally like Sutter, and he reminds me a lot, and I hate to talk about Greg Cronin all the time, but he reminds me a lot. But the reason Greg Cronin works in the American League is because he is effective in communicating with young players. And I think that's where it's difficult with Sutter and Calgary is he's not dealing with developing the young minds of players. He's dealing with established players, and that can be a really difficult task to get through to players who already have an idea of their identity, exactly how they want to play, how they want to be utilized, and it can be really hard to get everybody on board if there are odds.
Totally. Nazem Kadri made an interesting comment earlier this year, and I've mentioned it a couple times, about really, really good teams, great teams, versus championship teams. And he talked about how the messaging on championship teams comes from in the room. A great team, you can be a great team. And the messaging comes from the coaching staff and, strong head coach and things like that. And I wondered at the time if he was, kind of saying something there, like that leadership isn't quite in the room yet. And I think that's maybe where a guy like Sutter, you can't have him be the strongest voice. I wouldn't swap Sutter for Bednar ever, but I think a guy like Sutter could fit in on a team like last year's Colorado Avalanche group better. And I say last year because there's no Gabe this year, but where it's like, yeah, you don't need him to go in and deliver the message to the players. They get it. I think you don't quite have that in Calgary, and it's leading to some of that being at odds. And I think a big part of that is that there was massive changeover this year in Calgary.
Absolutely. So many new personnel and players.
So many. You lose Giordano the year before, then you lose Gaudreau, then you lose Tkachuk. That's genuinely, Meghan, like if the Avs lost Gabe Landeskog, then Nathan McKinnon, then Mikko Rantanen in the span of 12 months. Yeah, even if you replace that with 3 very good players, it's just going to look different and it's going to feel different, and there's going to be new voices in the room and new guys trying to carve out, okay, well, I was brought in to be a top-end player, but to your point, I haven't been here as long as some of these other guys. I haven't been established in this room. And then you've got a personality like Sutter. I think it was just this weird combination. So that's part of the reason why I think they stick with Sutter at least part of the way through next year. They're going to give themselves some runway here to see if they can course correct without massive sweeping changes.
I think we can gear up for the Chicago-Arizona conversation, because these are two groups that are also looking to this year's draft and hopefully gearing up for some changes. And honestly, I framed it in the piece as the Connor Bedard sweepstakes era, but it's bigger than just that. Even if not Bedard, this is a deep draft that is going to change the course for both of these teams, no matter what acquisition they're able to get. I think starting with Chicago, you were able to sit down with Jay and talk about the future of that team. I'm curious, too, because I didn't watch either of these interviews just yet. So I had my view on how the season went for each Arizona and Chicago. And Chicago is one that interests me more because I think there's a lot more uncertainty for me with what happens in the direction that Chicago is to move from here.
Yeah. No, totally. And part of the reason why, Meghan, you and I talked about, we thought these were especially relevant to talk with both Jay from CHGO and then Craig Morgan from PHNX. These are two Central Division teams. And yes, they're bottoming out right now. But to your point, and the point we made just a minute ago, talk about Washington and Arizona, this draft here in just a couple months could potentially change the landscape of the Central Division for 15 years. And with the way that both these teams, Arizona and Chicago, are kind of approach this season, the way that it went for both. Arizona maybe overachieves a little bit. Chicago, things kind of go exactly to plan. They finish in the bottom 3. They move on from guys like Kane, DeBrincat, and to your point, Jonathan Taves leaving this summer. These are fascinating teams in same but different ways than what we were just talking about with teams like Pittsburgh and Washington, who have been up here and are now starting the descent. These are teams that have been down here and are starting this climb out. We'll go ahead and drop in both of these interviews here. And look, I spoke with both of them for quite a bit. So these are nice kind of lengthy interviews, great conversations. Both Jay and Craig do phenomenal jobs covering both of these teams. So we'll drop them in right here, and just fascinating perspective on where these teams are at. And again, these have huge implications on the Central Division. Before we play these, did you just want to say anything else about how you kind of saw these two, or do you just want to let these go?
Other than just letting them go, I feel a lot of optimism surrounding what Arizona becomes in the future. I think they have a lot of potential to become a headache in the Central Division.
I agree.
And I wanted to shout that out.
If they get any draft lottery luck here, I'm with you. I've actually had this one kind of earmarked as a potential. We've talked about who can be that Avs rival. Now that Arizona's in the Central, I really do think that there is potential here. Even over the last 3-4 years, there has been some sneaky bad blood between these teams. It seems like every time the Avs and the Coyotes get together, there's nastiness after the whistle. There's fights. There's big hits, and they're entertaining games. Even with all the struggles that Arizona has had, they've kind of had the Avs number in the sense that like they always give them a good game. I think they get some lottery luck here. To your point, some of the pieces that they're adding, Logan Cooley. This has a potential to be a great head-to-head matchup at the Central for a few years. So we'll roll Chicago, we'll roll Arizona, and just kind of let you guys hear from Craig and Jay. All right, and now we'll head down to Arizona. Good buddy Craig Morgan, who does a fantastic job covering the Arizona Coyotes for PHNX. Craig, first of all, good to see you. Appreciate it. I know it's crazy times right now in Arizona. Not probably a fun season for you, but maybe a little bit better than we all expected at the beginning of the year.
I'm used to it by now, Jesse. I would say that they overachieved a bit, specifically at Mullet Arena, where, Mullet Arena was the butt of jokes when we started the season. And then the Coyotes just started winning games there. They won 21 games this year, which is not elite, but it's middle of the pack in the NHL. Which is not what anyone expected. Like when this season started, I couldn't find an analyst who thought that the Coyotes were anything close to a playoff bubble team. Most thought they'd be 32nd in the NHL. They ended up finishing with the 6th worst record. So yeah, they overachieved. Yeah,
no, they were a fun team to watch. Like Andre Tourigny seemed like he had, he pressed the right buttons. And I think that's important. You and I have talked before about Jared Bednar and kind of the culture he established here for the Avs. It feels like maybe that same thing is starting to form in Arizona. So I know we have the draft lottery odds were officially announced yesterday. I know we're still a ways from that. Let's just say, I'm not hoping for this for your guys' sake. Let's say they don't get Bedard.
Yeah.
What does this kind of look like here over the next season or two? They overachieved this year. Are they on an upswing? There's a lot of good young players coming through.
There are, and we still are waiting on a decision from Logan Cooley to see whether he's going to go back to the University of Minnesota for one more season before joining the Coyotes. I honestly don't think they'd mind if he goes back, but if he does sign, they'll get their development hands on him and get him going. There are a lot of people who think he's now a franchise player. Shout out to Chris Peters, who had him ranked #1 on his draft board last year going into the draft. He's looking a lot like the best player out of that draft right now, but we'll see. There's a lot to be proven. Having said that, this prospect pipeline is nowhere near complete. Bill Armstrong said it himself after the trade deadline. We're only about 50% of the way through the rebuild. Now, they've acquired a lot of draft assets. They have 47 draft picks over the next 4 seasons, which is insane.
Crazy.
They're not going to execute all those. They're probably going to use those to finally start trading for some young players that can grow with this group. But yeah, we saw the emergence of Clayton Keller this season into a bona fide NHL superstar. Lawson Krause has really emerged as a goal scorer. Matias Michelli's in the Calder Trophy conversation. And they've got a couple guys on the back end, and Juuso Valimaki and JJ Mosier, who may not be top pair guys, but they've proven that they can play in the NHL in log heavy minutes. So there are a lot of pieces here to work with. If they don't get Bedard, I just think it extends it a little bit. Listen, let's be honest here. And I know I've been banging this drum forever. You don't win cups without elite players. And Logan Cooley may be a guy, but I don't think anyone's saying that Logan Cooley is Nathan McKinnon or Patrick Kane, or you want me to go through the list of all the cup winners and the elite players they got at 1 or 2. Top 2 picks are really important to winning cups. You can talk all along, this is such a great organization. Well, what if they didn't get the #1 or #2 pick? Would they be considered such a great organization? Probably not. You need those guys to win cups. If they don't get it, they're just going to have to keep building with more depth. And they're going to get 2 good picks, right? They have Ottawa's pick as well, assuming Ottawa doesn't jump up into 2 or 3. So they'll pick wherever they pick, whether it's 6 worst right now. If they get lucky and get Bedard or even Adam Fantilli, that could change things a little bit, because then you get that franchise player right at the top of your lineup that speeds things along a little bit.
Totally. It's one of those things where, like, I want it for the Coyotes. They went out and they played hard. They didn't tank. You and I were talking how the players kind of had the running joke with Bill Armstrong that every time they won a game, I was like, sorry, Bill. It'd be nice to see them get rewarded for that a bit. Do you feel good about the direction they're going? Obviously, again, a lot hinges on the draft, but as things kind of sit right now, where do you fall on the path that they're on?
Well, I agree with the philosophy. That's what I'll say. There are a lot of people out there grading prospects and telling us this guy's going to be the next. Nobody knows. The draft is a crapshoot. Nobody knows until these guys get to the NHL. So all the hype about draft picks, whatever, I just block it out because nobody has a clue what they're talking about. The scouts,
lottery
really
tickets.
I mean, the scouts will tell you, I don't know if he's going to pan out. You just do your best. It's educated guesswork because the NHL draft age is too young. That's the big problem there. So they're just projecting on kids. But I like the philosophy. I have seen them enter rebuilds with this organization 3 times and shift course midstream. Wait, it's not done yet. What are we doing here? Oh, let's go get Taylor Hall and Phil Kessel and go for a cup. Well, you don't have any centers, so how are you going to win a cup? That's been the problem here in the past. And it's not always the GM's fault. There's pressure from ownership. We need to make money. That's always an issue in this market. But right now, it looks like GM Bill Armstrong and the ownership group are in lockstep on seeing this thing through. The other thing that it does is it dovetails with their plans for the new arena. If they can emerge from this as they move into a new arena, then that's the perfect scenario. But, you mentioned, you asked me if I like the direction of this organization. Well, ask me in a month when Tempe voters decide the fate of the new arena, because if that goes through, things are looking really promising for the Coyotes. If it doesn't go through, Jesse, I have no clue what comes next for this franchise.
So, I mean, you're beating me to the punch there a little bit. Gary Bettman was in town. It sounded like everything was kind of moving full steam ahead, but is there a little bit of a roadblock now potentially on the new arena? Was there new opposition that came up?
Well, the airport has been a roadblock on and off for a while. We thought it was all resolved when the Tempe City Council voted 7-0 in favor of sending this to referendum. And by the way, every member of the city council supports this. All the former mayors of Tempe support this. Business leaders, the Chamber of Commerce, they all support this deal because they see what it can mean economically to Tempe for what is literally a dump site that has been sitting there for 70 years. I know the opposition is like, well, we want to see something else done, like a parkway. Let's put a park there. First of all, the cleanup alone negates that possibility. Who's paying for the cleanup? The city of Tempe doesn't have the money for it. So sometimes when I hear the arguments for what they want on that site, I feel like I'm talking to children. Are you that naive that you think that that's what's going to happen on this expensive piece of real estate that, by the way, needs nearly a $100 million cleanup? And I think I've lost my train of thought here, Jesse, but I'm just rambling because there's so much stuff. But Bettman's in town. The airport is there again, but the airport, the lawsuit, we'll see how that plays out. There are all sorts of legal opinions on whether they have a case or not. But that can't stop the arena from going forward. They have an agreement in place. Okay. Theoretically, if the Coyotes want to break ground the day after the vote gets approved, they can do that. They won't, of course, because there's all sorts of examination of the site. I think they have to involve the Army Corps of Engineers because they have to clean up a site that could leak into the river. It's a toxic waste dump. So they have to clean it up. They have to, they have a lot. There's a lot of work there. So they have to probably assess before they can get shovels in the ground. But again, the vote will go through. These lawsuits cannot stop the vote. They will not stop the vote. And they cannot stop the Coyotes from breaking ground on the arena. What they can stop, if they were to win the case, if it even goes to court without a settlement, right? They could stop those residences, those multi-story residences from being built. And let's be honest, Alex Morello is not going to make his money off the arena. He's going to make his money off of all the ancillary stuff built around there. Wow. So if the residences get blocked, now you're talking about a major loss in revenue. Wow.
Okay. So that's kind of the issue right now is the big money maker is the part that's in jeopardy.
It's one of them, right? They're putting restaurants, they're putting a lot of other stuff there as well. But yeah, that's significant.
Yeah, no kidding. And again, that's one that I'd love to see go through, because when I was out there, you were kind of showing us around where it's going to be. To the point you're making, like it just makes too much sense, right? For that to go there, what else are you going to put there? Who's going to pay for it? You hope that goes through. And then I just keep pounding the drum that once that goes through, there's your ticket to Austin Matthews, and there's your elite player, Craig.
Yeah, I mean, listen, the best case scenario I've heard for them moving in, and maybe they're playing it safe, is that they wouldn't move in until the 25-26 season. So if you're talking about Austin Matthews, and I know people still dream about it here, you are talking, you're asking Austin Matthews, hey, do you want to come and play in Mullet Arena for 2 seasons? on a team that probably isn't there yet. That's a tough sell for me. I have a hard time believing Austin Matthews is coming home. If he were signed for one more season in Toronto and they could say, hey, it's 1 year and then we're ready to go, maybe, because he loves it here. He cares about this state. He literally comes here whenever he has free time. He's really good friends with Clayton Keller and Christian Fisher, who are both Coyotes, as you know. So there's a lot of lure for Austin Matthews, but right now, the situation for the franchise makes me believe it's a really tough sell for Austin Matthews.
Man, I genuinely do. I want to see good things for the Coyotes because I think it's a franchise, and the way that Gary Bettman puts it, I agree. I think the NHL needs to be in Arizona, and I think it's a very underrated, important market. So, yeah, I hope all that stuff gets sorted out quickly. Craig, I really appreciate it, man. Like I said, I know end of season is always a bit chaotic, so I appreciate you taking the time.
No problem at all, Jesse. Always great talking to you.
All right, and now we've got Jayzawaski from our great friends over at CHGO Blackhawks. Jay, I thought this conversation was particularly fitting because we spoke the night before the opening game of the season. So I guess here's my first question for you. We all knew it was going to be tough sledding for the Hawks this year, but did this kind of play out the way you were expecting it to?
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, early in the season, they had maybe a little bit more talent on the roster than I was comfortable with Max Domi and Athanasiou and Kane and Taves and, you kind of go up and down, Jake McCabe and Sam Lafferty. But, when the smoke clears here, they're going to be dependent on what happens tonight with the Blue Jackets. They're going to be either the third worst or second worst team in the NHL. And I think that's probably about what we expected. It's been, this kind of every night on our show, we do the tank standings and we do our tankathon wheel spin and see how we can get Connor Bedard here, right? That's been the focus really all year. But I think for the most part, this has gone exactly how we thought it was going to.
How many times have you guys run the simulator on your show?
Oh my, I mean, we did 82 post-game shows. We probably do at least 2 a night. So yeah, I would say probably 150 or so when you add up all the bonus. We say, hey, if you want a bonus spin, we need 10 more likes, and it seems to convert pretty well. So
it's there. Well, no, it's funny you say that. It's funny you say that about the beginning of the season because they were one of the teams, in the first 7 to 10 games, like they were outperforming some expectations, and I was kind of laughing. I was like, oh no, watch them, pull together and go on this, half like mediocre run. But so you mentioned, the beginning of the year, there was a lot more talent on the roster than how it ended. Jonathan Taves does play his final game as a Blackhawk yesterday. It was announced by the Hawks that they won't be re-signing him. Obviously, there was a lot that surrounded why he wasn't moved at the deadline with, I don't necessarily know if you want to call it an injury. Was it at any level disappointing for you that they weren't able to move Jonathan Taves in season and get something back for him, or were you happy with kind of the send-off yesterday?
I think the answer is kind of both, right? I think both things can be true. The head says, let's gather as many assets as we can and load up for the draft as much as we can and hurt the NHL roster as much as we can, right? But throughout yesterday's festivities, GM Kyle Davidson spoke in the morning. We talked to Luke Richardson before the game, and he made a point of saying, there's not a lot of players in this game that get to have something like Jonathan Taves is going to have tonight, where he gets the send-off from the home fans. And it is a 2.5-hour Jonathan Taves tribute from the Blackhawks and his teammates and the opponent and the fans and everybody. So I think the fact that Jonathan Taves was able to experience that, all in all, is that worth maybe the 3rd-round pick or 4th-round pick a team might have given up for him? I think so. For Hawks fans to have that memory, for Jonathan Taves to have that memory,
scores the goal too.
Valuable.
It scores a goal and kind of a nice.
Yeah, and then he gets the breakaway in overtime, and the place is, the roof's about to blow off the place, and he just misses. Even it's an inch wide, and then Provorov goes the other way and scores and ends the game. It was just a perfect night. And Jonathan Taves said so afterwards, and it's kind of hard to read the tea leaves on him sometimes, but and while he hasn't made a formal decision, it certainly sounds like, based on the things he was saying, that retirement is definitely on the table, and he might be leaning that way. A couple weeks ago, he said, when referring to what could happen next year, he said, if it's not a hell yes, then it's a hell no. And we discussed it on last night's show. I don't know how Jonathan Taves is going to get himself after everything he's been through health-wise, everything he's been through mentally, everything he's been through physically, to go find that will to get his body ready for another demanding NHL season in a city that doesn't love him like Chicago does. Right. I don't know how he gets to that point. He was clearly emotional last night. He said, I've always considered myself as someone who would retire a Blackhawk, and it's something I still think about. So if I was handicapping it, I would bet Jonathan Taves retires, but he's also one of the most competitive guys in the world. And if he starts feeling better in a couple of months, he might say, you know what? I'm going to give it one more run and see what I can do. I just feel like when you factor in the long COVID and the chronic immune response syndrome and all the concussions and everything he's achieved in his career, there's nothing more for him to prove. There's nothing more for him to do. He is an instant Hall of Famer. His number will be retired. He will, he'll have a statue outside United Center. Jonathan Taves has done everything anyone could ever dream of doing in hockey. And I think last night was a bit of a reminder to him of that.
No, totally. It's like you said, it's not just does he want to play? It's the toll on his body and getting himself back into shape and all that stuff. There's a lot to consider. I'm sure if he does come back, there are going to be teams lining up around the block to get his services, but it's going to be interesting. So we know he won't be back for the Hawks next year. That's the one thing we know. Yeah. Jay, how do you kind of picture the way this team is going to look next year? Obviously, a lot of that depends on the draft. If they land Bedard, that kind of changes everything. Right. But as it stands right now today, April 14th, how do you see this team next year? And how much longer do you think that they are in kind of this on the downside of this rebuild before you can start to see the light at the end of the tunnel?
Well, it's an interesting way to put it, because I think people that have been paying attention aren't seeing this as like a downside. They're seeing this as the way back up, right? I think if you're looking at the graph, the arrow is already starting to point up a little bit. Their prospect system jumped from like 25th to 5th in 1 year. Whoever they get in this draft, be it Bedard, Fantilli, Carlson, Mitchkov, whatever, that player immediately becomes their number one prospect. Yep. They've got another first-round pick. They've got 2 more next year. Like, they have just this abundance of riches in terms of draft capital. Now, Kyle Davidson said yesterday that the average team, you get an NHL player per draft, right? Yeah. That's kind of the league average.
Great way to put it.
Now, with all the assets they have, it's going to be a little more than that. But if they can convert 2 or 3 of these guys per draft, all of a sudden, things are looking up. They had a really good draft last year. Yeah. So when I look at the team next year, what we do know about Kyle Davidson is he's incredibly patient. I think Lucas Reichel is going to be a full-time NHL player. I don't think there's any doubt about that. We're going to see some of the defensemen that spent part of the year here kind of up and down between Rockford. They'll probably become permanent fixtures while Rockford fills in with a couple of the draft picks from last year and the year before. So that cycle is going to start going. I do think you're going to see some veterans brought in here too. I think there's a possibility that Max Domi comes back. Andreas Athanasiou ended up leading the Blackhawks in scoring. If you want to know how the Hawks season went, he was their leading scorer with 40 points. So he might be back. And don't forget the possibility of, hey, this team wants to make this big free agent splash, or they're up against the cap. And hey, the Hawks will take on your draft assets to take on your bad contracts, because the Hawks, I can't believe I'm saying this, they have to get to the cap floor, let alone the cap ceiling. And with Taves and Kane off the book, that's $21 million. You traded McCabe, that was $4 million. So your highest paid player, obviously Seth Jones, making $9.5 million. But aside from that, it's going to be a struggle to get to the cap floor. So I think when you look at somebody, I'll use Max Domi as an example, because Chicago fans really liked him. He liked it here. Whereas if he's a free agent and Dallas says, all right, we're going to bring you back for $3 million and you're going to be our third line winger, the Hawks can say, we're going to bring you back for $5 million.
Right.
You got to get to the cap floor and you're going to be our first line center. You know what I mean? Like, I think there's some appeal there. So it is going to be not just, the Rockford Blackhawks And it shouldn't. It shouldn't be.
Yeah.
We have seen what happens in this organization and around the league when prospects get rushed. It has ruined Adam Boquist. You could argue it ruined Kirby Dach. Henry Jokiharju probably hasn't developed into the star defenseman he could have because they were drafted and rushed to the NHL and not allowed to develop. We got frustrated as fans and observers when Lukas Reichel didn't start this year. But the Lukas Reichel we saw in his first call-up versus the guy that ended the season, they're totally different players.
Night and
They're
day.
totally different players, and Reichel is so much better because of the time he spent in Rockford, playing in all situations, playing top minutes, playing against top competition. So now he's ready to step in. I would bet that Lukas Reichel is the Blackhawks' leading scorer next year. I mean,
I wouldn't bet against you.
if he's not, he's right there. It's going to be neck and neck with whatever veteran they bring in, be it Domi or whoever, right?
Yeah.
So I think you're going to see a mix of short-term veteran contracts to bridge that gap between kids coming up, and you're probably still going to see them in top 5 picks again next year, but they're not. I don't think the mindset this year is finish as poorly as possible to get that top overall pick. I do think there's going to be a little bit more of a focus on trying to win, trying to compete, and just because of talent, they won't be able to. But I think it's going to be a little more fun to watch this year because
maybe closer
themselves to root for losses, and it's weird. It's a weird place to be.
Yeah, so next year maybe closer to like what Arizona did this year, where it's like, hey, fun, exciting team. You know, they're putting the effort in, but like you said, just not having the talent necessarily to compete. And then I just wanted to make this quick little comment about as frustrating as it can be sometimes as observers to, gosh, you want to see these guys. Avs fans went through that with Cale Makar a few years ago when he chose to stay for the second year in college. Everyone they wanted him to get there, and you understood why. But he talks even today about what a massive difference that second year made. Yeah. And you see the returns on it. He steps into an NHL playoff game, scores, in the first period. And so sometimes taking it that little bit slower can help. And I guess my last question for you here, one of the things that I appreciated about what the Blackhawks did this year, and you've been talking about it this whole time, I get so frustrated, whether it's in hockey or any other sport, when teams get kind of stuck in this weird cycle where they're not willing to commit to the rebuild and they really just kind of end up in purgatory. Yes. The Hawks committed to the rebuild and they're stripping it down. How do you, Jay, like yourself, feel about the direction of where this is going? Do you feel like they're on the right track or there's still adjustments to be made?
Yes, this is long overdue. And when you look around the league and you see teams like Nashville, that are kind of like middling it, they're never
Vancouver.
A cup threat. They're never going to get that top 5 pick that's going to change their franchise. They're just very willing to make that one-round playoff revenue and call it a day and keep the seats full. That keeps you in hell for 20 years, 30 years, right? That is not the way to win. And this Hawks rebuild is overdue. And what I love about Kyle Davidson is he has been ruthless. You think about a first-year GM came in, has never GM'd in this league before. He traded Brandon Hagel, Alex DeBrincat, Kirby Dach, Patrick Kane, Jake McCabe, Sam Lafferty, and he is walking away from the greatest captain in franchise history. And he said yesterday, me focusing on nostalgia and the past is doing nothing for this organization's future.
Damn.
That's it.
Yeah.
And as a fan, it can be hard, and it's difficult to watch Jonathan Taves walk away. It's going to be weird. And as much as your brain says this makes perfect sense and trading Patrick Kane makes perfect sense, it doesn't make it easy, but it's a GM's job to do the difficult things. And Kyle Davidson has not been afraid of it. Whether or not this pays off remains to be seen. But when we look at the early returns of everything he's done, aside from the hurt feelings and the sadness, I don't know how you can be critical of it. He's hired a terrific head coach. I mean, the Hawks, for as little talent as they had, were competitive in 75 of the 82 games they played. With Peter Mrazek and Alex Stalock splitting time in net when they weren't hurt. Like, this team gave themselves a shot to win every night, and they just didn't have the guns. And the fact that you can have a team compete as hard as they did with all of the distractions this year, with all of the roster moves, with all the new faces, that speaks volumes. And every player today that spoke had nothing but praise for Luke Richardson. And Kyle Davidson yesterday said, I can't think of a single misstep that Luke Richardson had all year. And I agree with him. I think he has been absolutely terrific. The Hawks knocked it out of the park with this hire. And it's great to know that when this team is ready to compete again, they've got the guy to lead that next generation. He's already here. There's no Bridgman. There's no Dennis Savard here like there was before Joel Quenneville. Luke Richardson is the guy now and going forward.
That's a great point you make about Kyle Davidson being a first-year GM. I hadn't really thought about that. You know, that takes a pretty big pair to come in as a first-year GM and say, this is what I'm doing. I'm gutting it, you know, and starting over. And again, I make the parallels you're talking about, you know, coaching. I make the parallels to the Avs again. Jared Bednar comes in. They have the 48-point year. It's a disaster, but they said, no, we believe in what he's doing. We are seeing what he's building behind the scenes. This is the guy. 5 years later, he's leading your team to a Stanley Cup. So that is a sneaky, underrated big part of this, having that guy in place. You know, he's as important as any of the players that you can put on the ice.
Yeah. And before we wrap up, I don't know if you have any more questions, but I just want to remind you and the Avalanche fans listening that we talk about this all the time. When we started our season in Denver, where we met you guys for the first time, did our show together, I pleaded with all of you to cherish what you're having in Colorado, to make sure you do not grow tired of the regular season games and the dominance and, just get me to the playoffs. I was saying last night to Greg and Mario, fellas, what I would give for a regular season game that mattered again.
Seriously.
It's crazy. And for years and years, from 2009 to 2016, it was like regular season. Right. Please don't waste my time with this nonsense. Just get me to the playoffs so I can watch my team dominate again. And it's gone. That. It's gone. The Hawks have not won a playoff series since they won the Stanley Cup.
Holy smokes.
Yep.
Jay, I needed that reminder more than anything else, because I'll be honest with you, I've spent the last 3 weeks going like, come on, let's get this going. Let's get to the end. So that is a nice reminder, even for me, because it's so easy to take that for granted. It's so easy to take that for granted.
It's fleeting. It'll be gone before you know it. And even if you get, like the Hawks did, a 3-year run, a dominant decade, you know, that's great, but it's over. I mean, think about like the Hawks' greatness lasted 6 years, 7 years.
Well, and it's funny you say that, because even going back to the start of last season to now, like it's a blur. 2 seasons are gone.
Oh yeah,
and like it's crazy. Jay, I've already taken more of your time than I told you I'd take. I super appreciate it. Make sure you guys are following all of the CHGO Blackhawks contributors. You guys do phenomenal work over there, and it's gonna be a big summer for you guys. And look, this is a Central Division. All of this stuff impacts the Avs and the future of the Central. So make sure you guys are following Jay, Mario, and Greg, and just CHGO Blackhawks in general. Jay, really appreciate it.
Welcome back. So we have series previews out for all of the matchups right now, including talking about Seattle, Colorado. So I understand you probably expect us to talk about that matchup. Game 1's tomorrow. I'm really excited for it. But go to our YouTube, which you're already on if you're watching this, and there's a playlist created with all of these videos if you want to hear some of our thoughts about this Seattle, Colorado matchup.
Maybe we'll even have Yaya drop in the Avs Seattle one at the end of this, so it just kind of plays right at the end, or at least a piece of it, maybe our predictions, something like that. But yeah,
it's a great idea.
We spent about 4 hours in the studio here on Saturday building out all these previews, so instead of just regurgitating everything we said, go check those out. We'll drop in a piece of it here at the end. But yeah, there's a lot of stuff we want to get to, like we said, before the playoffs actually kick off, because that will be taking 95% of our attention here for the next couple months.
Definitely. It'd be funny if we gave different predictions here than we did in
the
series.
I was going to say, that's also the other thing. I don't want to contradict myself. There's been a lot of stuff that has been coming through my brain here in the last 48 hours.
No, I understand that completely. So we'll finish out the show with a conversation a little bit about conditioning and recovery, because I think it's a conversation we've been unable to avoid this year, not just in talking about Gabriel Landeskog and his rehabilitation, but in looking at the number of injuries the Avs have had. The varying nature of injuries that they've had too has made this a difficult conversation to navigate, because no matter your team, no matter the organization, I think when injuries happen like this, and as many stack up in this way, people become concerned with the conditioning staff and the medical staff and the decisions that get made. So I wanted to start with everything that we've heard this year from players and from Bednar reasonably is an endorsement of the staff that they have on hand. They have trust in the staff and the decisions that are made, and find them to be fully capable of these decisions. And I just wanted to talk about it a little bit, how you've heard that conversation play out too.
Yeah, it's interesting, Megan, because like you said, there seems to be the knee-jerk reaction of what's going on. Are they not getting the proper treatment? Are they not getting, the one that you hear all the time is like, are they not preparing them for games well enough? And I really do. I think in a year like this, been kind of freak injuries. You know what I mean? Like stuff that you can't really prepare for.
Broken hand, concussion protocols. Not sure exactly what the nature of McKinnon's injury was, but it didn't keep him out terribly long.
Right. Josh Manson, it was one where they got him all the way back to full health. Small thing happens, tweaks it again. You even look at Gabe Landeskog, right? And you can find it. You can find the tweet either in Sundays at the Rink, or I did retweet it, or I quote tweeted it. I think it was on Friday. What the thing that starts all of this is like the freakiest of freak injuries. It's a skate cut across the knee,
right, with Landeskog,
right, and so it's just like all of this stuff it's stuff you can't predict for, or it's stuff you can't predict, you can't prepare for, none of that. All you can do is work your hardest to get back. And I think that's the part that being back in the locker room this year really did give me just that extra level of appreciation for what all these injured players go through to get back. And it's the mental side of it, it's the work in the gym, it's the work with the trainers. And I had a conversation with Nathan McKinnon at the beginning of the year when he came back from his injury. And I told him, I said, this is a stupid question. It's nice to be back though, right? And he mentioned the part that is the most difficult is he said, we've got our routines here. I know. And I don't remember exactly what he said, but I know I get up and I have my I have a workout and I have my breakfast and I get to the rink, I do this, and then I lift, and then we get on the ice, and then we do that, and then we have meetings, and we do this, and then I go home, and you start the recovery process, and all of that stuff that you get back up and you do the next day. And he goes, when you're rehabbing, all of that is thrown out of whack. It's you get up and you start rehab, and you start working on this, and you're working with the trainers, and you're stretching, and you're building strength back, and you're not around the team, and you're not traveling. And he was just saying, like, it's a completely different grind. And all you want is to get back, to get out of this other grind that is just out of the ordinary for you.
I'm glad you mentioned that too, because it's come up from different players like Josh Manson and talking about the mental toll of rehabilitating an injury at points this season. Part of it's being away from the main group. He even talked about how it can be sad, I don't know if that's the word he used, but to practice alone when you're doing just those, before the group gets together with Sean Laird passing pucks around, that can become a little sad to not be around the team on the ice. And I think the mental toll it takes is an interesting side in all of that, in the recovery. And it's why I appreciated that they brought all of the players on that last road trip so that they could be around one another this time of year. And why I appreciated too that the charity brunch and the gala also happened at the end of the year, to have these team events to bring guys, injured or not, back together.
100%. It's I think it's such an underrated part of this. And again, I'm going to draw a parallel here that I know before I even say it is nowhere close to what we're talking about here. But
I'm so excited to see what this is.
So last year, going through the playoff run, I was lucky enough, and I'm heading to Seattle on Friday. So hopefully we're in for another long run here, Megan, where I get to feel worn down by the travel at the end. But there were times, it was the Game 6 in St. Louis in particular. What a moment, right? That's one of those ones that I will always, remember sitting there and watching that play almost kind of unfold in slow motion, all that great stuff. It was great, But I just remember after and getting on Twitter and I'm back at the hotel room and I'm writing and, getting stuff cranked out. And I just remember seeing all the stuff on Twitter, the videos of the bar here, you guys on the set, just people, just everyone just kind of rallying around what an amazing moment that was. And I remember being like, damn, I'm out here, doing something. I'm working just as hard as they are. We're all pulling the rope in the same direction, but it's just a little different being here in St. Louis in the hotel room by myself, going through all this stuff. And it is just one of those things where it's like, you have to be able to be mentally, going back to the NHL side of things, you have to be mentally strong enough to be able to work through that stuff on your own, or with, out there with Sean Laird, and knowing that, the team, huge win last night. Oh my gosh, what a big comeback. And they win it in overtime, big emotional win. They all get on the plane, smacking high fives. Woo, let's get out there. Oh, we're going to Vegas. We got a day off or whatever. And you've got a bucket of pucks and an empty sheet of ice. You have to be mentally tough enough to push through that. And that's where I don't think, forget just the Avs this year. I don't know if pro athletes get enough credit for being able to flip the mindset like that and be able to work through this stuff. And I also don't think pro athletes get enough credit for, like, these are special human beings. You have to be wired a special way. I'm not going to go down the rabbit hole. There's a player that you and I have talked about before. And we say that's the one thing that we've always worried about with him is, does he have that mental side to get there? And I think that's an underrated part of what it takes to compete at that level. And it's part of the reason why you see so many of these players that after they retire go on to, live very successful lives, whether it be in business, owning companies, or in management in the sports side of it, because they understand what it takes and they understand that mental grind. And I think so much of that is what helps them get through these long injury stretches. Think of a guy like Josh Manson. This has been a brutal year for him. He said the other day, this has been the most challenging year of his career. And he hasn't played in a ton of games. That should tell you how hard it is to rehab and get back to a point where you can compete at that level.
Absolutely. I imagine it's an isolating experience and why it's so difficult for players to retire and step away from the sport, because deviating from a routine that you've had your entire life, wherein parts of it is being around the group, has to be really challenging. And we talk about pro habits and how different types of development paths prepare players with pro habits. And it maybe sounds like too big of an umbrella term, but part of pro habits is the commitment to how they take care of themselves away from the rink. And this has become an emerging theme for the Avalanche group this year, because Bednar talks about it at length, how even around the deadline, McFarland talked about how players take care of themselves is culturally what will make them fit in with this group too. And I talked to Logan O'Connor, and I feel bad because I went to him and I said, you've had a good track record with your health this year. And he knocked on his head. So hopefully that didn't do anything. But I asked him about what he does to take care of himself and what his approach to conditioning is. And I think it is interesting that the first thing he said is that he looks to Nate and that the group looks to Nate. And I wanted to talk about this because I know McKinnon has sort of drawn criticism for this quality in him in the past, and I wanted to provide a little more context, because the way that Logan O'Connor described how the team looks to him, it makes a lot of sense. One, it sounds voluntary. It sounds as if players look to McKinnon because they want to, because they admire how he approaches conditioning. And part of it that O'Connor mentions is the resources that McKinnon has, because he is a top athlete in the world. He has explored a lot of different options and has found through his research a lot of best available options in terms of nutrition, supplements, these other things that they could seek out, whether it be like red light therapy, cryotherapy, I'm sure acupuncture, all of these things, diet too, just like how they eat every single day. I don't think this is something that he is commanding. I think they're looking to him for input and for insight in how to approach this, because through his resources he has found some of the best possible methods, and they obviously work for him because they see how he's emerged as a top talent, just gets better every single year. And I liked the way that was explained. It wasn't painting Nathan McKinnon as this strict
tyrant
ruler in the locker room, but rather a wealth of knowledge.
So go back to Nate's first, I think it was a 90-point season or whatever.
The one that was nearly there.
Yeah. Was it
20?
I think it was the year that they it was the year after the 48-point season.
18? Okay.
Yeah, so I'm going to get it pulled up here.
18.
Yeah, but it was 17-18. He went from a career high in his rookie year of 63 points to a 97-point player. He's never looked back, right? He's been among the elite of the elite. I'm expecting him to be a Hart Trophy finalist for the third or fourth time here in just a couple months. And he talks about, it was that summer I decided to start. I didn't want to be a good player anymore. I wanted to be a great player. I wanted to be an elite player. I wanted to be a top player in this league. And to your point, he started investing in his health, his nutrition, his body, the way he trains, the way he recovers after games. That was one of the most fascinating things that I found when all of this stuff kind of started breaking after the Nikita Zadorov interview a couple of years ago, was how Nate talked about that, especially in the playoffs, he's got a guy who he lives here in Colorado during the season, and after games, Nathan MacKinnon goes home and recovers with this. I don't necessarily know if you want to call it a trainer or a nutritionist or whatever. But he said, your adrenaline is running so high anyways, you're not sleeping for hours. That's when I start recovering. And it's how can you not, if you're on that team, how can you not look at what he's doing, the success he's had, and the way he drives this team, commands greatness out of himself. How can you not look at that and say, if he can do that, I have to do that.
Right. I want to know what you're doing.
You know, Megan, like if I was coming in, here every day and you were here 2 hours before me and you had I'm just going to make up a false equivalent here, a journalism teacher that you had at DU, and you're constantly leaning on them. Hey, here's what I wanted to do. Here's the kind of article I'm wanting to write. Here's this, that, and the other. And you're constantly pulling from resources. I couldn't, like me personally, I couldn't sit there and be like, ooh, well, I can't do anything short of what she's doing. You know what I mean? Like, it's that same type of pressure that I don't think it's that you would be putting that on me. It'd be pressure that I'm like, well, I want to match the level that she's at. She's putting in, 5 hours before I even show up. I need to be doing that. And I think that's kind of what you have with Nathan MacKinnon, where he kind of sets the tone of like, hey, these are the expectations that I have for myself. And if they're good enough for me, well, they're good enough for me. I'll leave it at that. And I think it's the culture in the room. People want to follow that lead. We joke all the time now that, like, after a game, we're leaving the media room and they're all heading over to the weight room. And from what I've gathered, Nate was one of the ones that started that, because he said, this is how I find I recover best, is by working, getting in a workout immediately after. They all said, well, if that's how Nate recovers best, that's how I'm recovering.
It's all but confirmed, too, because you're talking about the emphasis on post-game recovery, and in asking O'Connor what he's adopted into his regimen that's been particularly helpful, it's post-game recovery. Verbatim, that's what he would tell you. And though I don't know the intangibles of that, I know it includes the workout after the game, and I have to imagine it's exactly for the reason you're saying this is being led by Nate. I'm sure that if players wanted to opt out, they could, but they also probably wouldn't be culturally a very good fit here.
Well, and again, it's one of those things where it's like, do you want to be the one person who's not heading over there when 19 other guys are? I wouldn't want to. I wouldn't want to be the only one. And again, I don't think anybody would shun them for that. I don't think they would be, traded immediately. But it's just, these are the expectations. The expectations is that you are ready to go. We have, the Avs were money. As much as we all hated it, as much as they all hated it, the Avs were money in back-to-backs this year, particularly in the second half. You just won't convince me otherwise that this doesn't have a huge role in that. They understand how to get the most out of themselves and how to recover and how to be able to turn that around quick. And it's paying dividends.
And I think the biggest component in all of it is the players want to.
They want to, yes.
Because they look to MacKinnon and they see the success he has. And I think that's what makes a player successful in Colorado, too.
Even Jared Bednar. How many times have we heard him this year come into the locker room and be like, are we ready? Avs PR will tell him, no, not you. He'll be like, cool, come get me. I'll be in the gym.
No, you're right.
Like, it's just, it's top to bottom. Those are the habits. And I think back to the Avs playoff video last year that played in arena before the start of every game. at Ball Arena through all 4 rounds. It opened with Jared Bednar addressing the team in the locker room. It was just the audio. And he said, make sure your goals, your actions and your goals, what was it? Make sure your actions today and every day align with your goals and the goals of this team. If they don't, there's the door. You're welcome to leave. If you don't want to put in the work, if you don't want to do what it takes to get to this level, that's fine. We don't think you're a bad guy. We are all doing that. We are doing whatever it takes. That's workouts after, if that's getting in early, if that's supplementing regular pasta for chickpea pasta. We are willing to do every last thing. We're willing to make every last sacrifice and commit every last moment to achieve this goal. We want everyone on the same page. And I think what's great about it is everybody bought in and they got to they got to, not immediately, they got to reap the benefits of it. There's a banner hanging in Ball Arena forever now that says 2022 Stanley Cup champions. And they all now understand, not only do I commit this way just to be a better player and all that stuff, that's why we do this.
I think part of the culture too, I'll begin wrapping this up too. I know we're pressed for time, but is not just the conditioning, the recovery, and the commitment to how they take care of themselves away from the rink, but also how they conduct themselves away from the rink. Mm-hmm. And I can't speak to this Avalanche group's, how they operate away from the rink. I just know how other teams in the NHL do. And the teams I know of that had to enforce team curfews this year on the road were because players were going out and showing up to practices still not doing well. And this is just not something that this Avalanche group has had to impose for a reason. And those teams that had to bring about team curfews on the road aren't in the playoffs right now.
And I think it's why you've seen the Avs target high character leadership type players, whether it be through the draft, college free agents, things like that. They have a culture they built here and they want to, they want it to sustain because they understand that that's what it takes to get to the end. Look, I go back to that Western Conference final last year, that Edmonton Oilers team, Connor McDavid kind of willed them to that point. And then I keep saying, you look at the contrast in those two teams last year, not getting into it this year. I think Edmonton learned a lot of lessons in that Western Conference final last year. And I think what we're talking about here, Meghan, was the difference. And you saw what a massive difference it made. Edmonton had Connor McDavid going at an unbelievable clip. Leon Draisaitl producing at a high rate in that Western Conference final. And it didn't make a lick of difference. This Avalanche team was just too committed, top to bottom. They just couldn't compete. And I think Connor McDavid and the Edmonton Oilers learned a lot of lessons in that series last year. I think that's why they're a better, more well-rounded team this year. But we'll see. It takes a lot more than just good players on the ice. And I think the Avs learned that. And I think we have been very lucky now, Meghan, over the last 2 seasons to get to see that firsthand. And I think we maybe now have a different perspective on, when you see some of these other teams having to put in curfews and stuff like that, it's like, yeah, I see what a championship team looks like up close. That ain't it.
Definitely. Okay. We're going to have more content coming for you later this week. So just keep an eye out for, all of it.
I think we're going to have a lot of content coming this week. Really
excited. This is what we have been gearing up for all year, and it makes the 82-game season well worth it.
Yep.
But that is it for today. DNVR Avalanche at the Rink podcast. I'm Meghan Angley, and this is Jesse Montano.
It's time to find out that you're all cowards. Yep. I knew it.
He's right. I am honestly feeling a sweep in this.
I think Seattle gets one in their building. My guess is Avs go up 3-0 and Seattle fights it off in Game 4 to put on a show for the crowd. It's a great moment. They get a win. Everyone feels good. Everyone knows the series is over, but they feel good leaving.
And they kind of wave goodbye to the team like, hey.
Thanks. That was awesome. Yeah.
This has been a great season. We can't wait to see you next year.
That's
Meghan,
what I think it is.
Marginally more faith in Seattle.
I like the way they've matched up against the Avs in the regular season, and that is understanding that the Avs have been really depleted when they've taken on Seattle. So that's a fair point to make. But we don't know what Seattle is like as a playoff team, and I don't want to underestimate them. I've never seen them in postseason form. I'm curious to see what that actually looks like. And they've been afforded luxuries that the Avs have not this season, and that is in their forward depth. They've been able to scratch players who've had 46-point seasons, and the Avs just don't have that right now with Cogliano and Malgin in question, that the depth is going to be truly, truly tested. Going back to the conversation about the decor, though, I think that the Avs having a healthy defensive group is like having extra forwards on the ice at times, and so I don't think it's going to be that hard for the Avs. I don't know if I'd stand totally by 4-2 or not, but maybe 4-1. I don't know. But all that to say, I think it's going to be a loud building in Seattle. I think they're going to have a really passionate fan base that is excited about this moment. So I'm going to give Seattle some credit there, and I'm just excited to see how it goes.
It's going to be fun, one way or another.
Brief, but fun.